My name is Jordan Whitaker, and I'm 34 years old. I work as a special agent in the cybercrimes division of the FBI. Some people think that sounds glamorous, but let me tell you, the hours are brutal, the pressure is suffocating, and sometimes you forget you're a person and not just a badge. Still, none of that prepared me for the sound of my father's voice on the voicemail that night. The message was short. It always was with him. I saw your little segment on the news. You always did like attention. Doesn't change what you are, Jordan. A failure's still a failure. Click. I remember staring at my phone, still in my heels and blazer, my back against the wall of my apartment. I had just come home from the DC field office after a 14-hour day of media interviews and interagency briefings. Everyone kept calling me a hero because we'd just dismantled one of the largest identity theft rings in U.S. history. I'd been the lead agent on the case. 16 months of encrypted messages, dead-end trails, midnight warrants, and one very close encounter with a man who would have happily killed me to erase what we found. I should have felt proud. I should have been celebrating. Instead, I stood in my hallway clutching my phone like it was evidence in a case I hadn't closed. That voicemail. That was the only message I'd received from my father in 7 years. Not a word when I graduated from Quantico. Nothing when I made my first major bust, and complete silence when I was awarded the Director's Medal of Excellence. But somehow, this moment, me being on national television standing beside the director himself, was what prompted him to call. Not to say he was proud, not to say he'd seen me, but to cut me down with surgical precision. Like always, doesn't change what you are. I sat down on the floor and finally let the numbness slip. My breath shook. My hands did too. And deep inside, that old voice I thought I'd buried came crawling back from the grave. You'll never be enough. It had always been this way. Growing up in Norfolk, Virginia, in a 2-story brick house that smelled like shoe polish and gun oil, you didn't get praise for doing something right. You just didn't get yelled at. My dad, Colonel Whitaker, as everyone in the neighborhood called him, ran our household like a training base. Up at 0500, chores by 0600. No talking back, no slouching, and definitely no crying. That was for the weak. He said it like it was scripture. My brother Thomas fit into that world perfectly. Tall, lean buzz cut since middle school. West Point by 19. Yes, sir, no, sir, like it was in his DNA. My father called him my legacy. When Thomas spoke, my father's eyes softened just barely. When I did, they didn't even move. Me, I liked books, coding, building things with my hands. I didn't want to shoot rifles or recite chain of command structures. I wanted to learn about how people thought, why systems broke, how vulnerabilities hid in plain sight. I asked questions. My father hated questions. At dinner, I'd try to speak and he'd cut in, eyes fixed on his plate. Speak when you have something to contribute. So I stopped speaking. When Thomas died in that accident, Navy SEAL training, 21 years old, the pride of the family, my world cracked open. Not just because I'd lost my brother, but because from that day forward, I became the placeholder for everything my father had lost. And he didn't hide his contempt. You had all the time in the world to get your act together, he said once, 4 days after the funeral. He didn't waste his potential. I didn't respond, just like I didn't respond that night to the voicemail. Instead, I walked over to the mirror in my bathroom, still wearing the navy blue suit I'd worn on camera. There was still powder on my cheeks, the faint hint of lip gloss. The face of Agent Whitaker composed, sharp, in control. But the woman in the mirror wasn't composed. She was aching. She was still that 17-year-old girl who got into MIT's computer science program on her own merit, only to be told that real Americans don't hide behind screens. Still that 23-year-old woman who walked across the Quantico stage and imagined for a second that maybe, just maybe, he'd be in the crowd. And still, even now at 34, that woman looked into the mirror and whispered, "Why does it still hurt?" The next morning, I showed up to the office like nothing had happened. I shook hands, answered questions from Justice Department liaisons, and updated the chain of custody reports for our key evidence from the raid. Business as usual. But it wasn't usual. Not anymore. Because something had cracked loose in me. And once it cracked, it didn't stop. At lunch, I sat in the break room and my colleague Tanya nudged me. Hey, that interview, you crushed it. My aunt in Chicago sent me a screenshot like, "You work with her." She grinned. I smiled. Sort of. Thanks. You okay? I opened my mouth to lie. Habit. And then my dad left me a voicemail, called me a failure. Tanya blinked. Wait, after the news thing? I nodded. Jesus, she muttered. What kind of man does that I didn't answer? Because the truth was, I already knew the answer. The kind of man who didn't see his daughter. Never had. And maybe never would. I was born on a Wednesday. My mother used to say it was raining when they brought me home light spring rain, the kind that made the air smell like wet grass and the earth itself. She told me that story exactly once. I think it was after I broke my arm falling out of a tree when I was 10. She wrapped the ice pack too tightly, like she was scared I might break again in other ways. She always had that fear in her eyes. My father, on the other hand, never looked scared. Just disappointed. We lived in a cul-de-sac in Norfolk, 5 miles from the naval base, in a house that always had a flag on the porch and exactly 3 types of breakfast eggs oatmeal, or you make it yourself. He wore his military discipline like a second skin, and even after retiring from the Marines, he still shaved every morning before 6 a.m., ironed his pants with a crease you could slice bread on, and barked orders at the toaster if it burned his bread. When I was young, I tried to get his attention the way kids do, showing him my drawings, trying to impress him with my spelling test scores. But all of that was noise to him. What mattered was results, discipline, order. None of which I seemed to deliver the way he liked. My brother Thomas did, 3 years older, built like a poster for West Point. Even as a teenager, he had a presence calm, precise, untouchable. He'd recite military history like bedtime stories. I remember watching him polish his boots at night like it was a sacred ritual. My father would just stand there nodding. That's my boy. Once when I was 12, I beat Thomas in a local science competition. First place. My project was about network encryption simplified, of course, because no judge wanted to hear about AES ciphers from a middle schooler. I remember clutching that blue ribbon like it was gold. We got home, and I waited for my father to say something. Anything. Instead, he said, "Thomas, you'll still do better next time." He didn't even look at me. That night, I sat on the porch and cried into my hoodie. My mother came out, stood beside me, silent. She didn't say much, just rubbed my shoulder once and went back in. That was how she loved us, with quiet touches, soft gestures like a bird scared of being noticed. By the time I hit high school, I stopped trying to fit into his expectations. I leaned hard into computers. I took on freelance coding jobs. By 16, started learning about white hat hacking on forums I probably wasn't supposed to be on. I wasn't a rebel in the way he feared. I didn't drink, didn't party, but I rebelled by refusing to bend to his version of success. He wanted West Point. I applied to MIT. When I got in full ride, I brought the letter to the dinner table. I laid it right in front of him, bold letters, Massachusetts Institute of Technology, Department of Computer Science. He didn't even touch it. "So what are you going to do? Hide in a basement your whole life?" I didn't answer. I was 17. I still had hope. I thought maybe, just maybe, once he saw what I could do, he'd understand. He'd come around. He didn't. I moved out 3 months later. He didn't help with a dime. Didn't say goodbye. Just stood on the porch with his arms crossed while I packed the used Honda my uncle had given me. My mother stood in the doorway, lips pressed together like she wanted to scream, but had forgotten how. College was a blur. I worked nights at a diner and spent the rest of my time in labs debugging until my eyes bled. I wasn't the smartest in the room, but I was the most stubborn. I graduated magna cum laude and applied to the FBI's honors internship program on a dare from my roommate. Cybercrime had exploded in scope. By then, phishing scams, ransomware, deep web trafficking, and the Bureau was desperate for people who could think like the criminals without becoming them. When I got the acceptance letter, I stood in my studio apartment and read it 5 times. I called home that night. My mom answered. "He's not here," she said quietly. "Can you tell him I don't think he wants to know?" I heard the TV in the background, probably an old war movie. She hesitated. "I'm proud of you, Jordan." It should have meant more, but it didn't fill the space he'd left. At Quantico, I trained like hell. I wasn't the best shot. I wasn't the fastest runner, but I knew how to push through. I'd spent a lifetime doing it. One night, after a brutal physical exam where I'd failed the upper body strength test by 3 reps, I sat on the locker room bench and sobbed. Not because I was weak, but because I knew my father would have laughed. Can't even pass the basics. I passed it on the retake 3 days later. I never told him. The first few years in the bureau were quiet. I kept my head down, focused on casework. My specialty became digital forensics, tracing crypto wallets, breaking through layers of IP shielding, dismantling darknet marketplaces. I saw the worst of humanity through a screen. I saw how much damage could be done by someone with just a laptop and no conscience. But for the first time in my life, I also saw something else: that my skills mattered, that I could save lives, that I could help someone even if they never saw my face. And that, for a while, was enough. Until Operation Glass Veil. Until the case that made headlines. Until I stood on a podium, cameras flashing, and everyone was watching except him. And then his voice came through my phone like a ghost from every failed birthday: "An ignored report card doesn't change what you are." That's when I realized I had spent every single year since leaving home chasing his approval like it was a finish line. But there was no ribbon, no applause, just silence. And I was done chasing it. I didn't sleep the night after the voicemail. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the hum of the refrigerator through the walls and the occasional car rolling down the street outside my apartment. My body was exhausted, but my brain wouldn't shut off. Every word of that message played on repeat, scraping at my chest like sandpaper. I got up around 4 a.m. and pulled on a hoodie, poured myself coffee I didn't want, sat at the kitchen table staring at my FBI credentials like they were written in another language. Special Agent Jordan Whitaker. To most people, that title meant strength, justice, power. To me, that morning it felt like armor that was starting to crack. Later that day, I was scheduled for a press Q&A. Operation Glass Veil had been our most significant takedown in years, an international cybercrime ring that had stolen over $40 million in identity fraud, targeting veterans, single mothers, and the elderly. It had taken us nearly 2 years to unravel the web of shell accounts and fake domains, and when we finally arrested the ringleader in Seattle, I'd felt triumphant, vindicated, like the long hours and strained relationships and self-doubt had finally meant something. But standing on that stage in front of reporters with microphones and smiles, I felt like a fraud. The lights were too bright, the applause too loud, my voice sounded mechanical. I answered questions with practiced precision, nodded politely at the right moments. Internally, I was spiraling. I saw a flashbulb go off and imagined my father watching the footage at home. Maybe he'd seen it, maybe he hadn't. Either way, I knew what he'd say. "So what, you arrested a few nerds with laptops? No matter what I did, he'd reduce it." That night, my inbox was full of congratulations. Old professors, colleagues from training, even a few distant relatives. My mom sent a single text: "You looked strong. Thomas would have been proud." I stared at that message for a long time, and then my phone rang. Unknown number, but I knew the pattern. I answered. His voice was as familiar as it was foreign, gravelly, controlled, cold. "You made the news. I didn't say anything. It's funny. You always wanted attention? Guess you got it." "Dad," I finally managed. "Do you really think that's what this was about? What else would it be? A real daughter would have worn a uniform. You're just playing pretend behind a computer." His words landed like punches. He didn't yell. He didn't insult. He just reduced everything I had done, everything I had built, shrunk to a childish act of defiance in his mind. I should have hung up. Instead, I whispered, "I saved lives. Don't flatter yourself, Jordan. You sit behind a desk. You never bled for this country. You never understood what it means to serve." That one hit deeper than I expected, because I had bled. Not on a battlefield maybe, but in silence, in effort, in sacrifice, in missing birthdays, relationships, pieces of myself I could never get back. And yet, it still wasn't enough for him. "Is that all I asked?" My voice didn't shake. I made sure of it. "Yeah, that's all." Click. No goodbye. No hesitation. Just a disconnection, both technical and spiritual. I set the phone down and realized I was trembling. Not from fear, but from something deeper. Anger. grief, a need that wouldn't die no matter how hard I tried to bury it. The next few days were a blur. Everyone around me was buzzing media still covering the sting victims calling in to thank us, the Bureau prepping internal commendations. My supervisor, Agent Ramirez, called me into his office. "You holding up fine," I said too fast. "You sure you've been quieter than usual?" I hesitated, then lied again. Just tired. He nodded slowly, then gestured to the wall behind him, a framed photo of his own daughter, maybe 5 years old, grinning in a school uniform. "You know," he said gently, "being good at this job doesn't mean you have to carry everything alone." I smiled, tight-lipped. "Thanks, sir." But I left that meeting feeling worse, not better, because the truth was I did carry it alone. I always had, and I was starting to feel the weight crack my spine. That night, I skipped dinner and sat in the dark of my living room. On the wall was a photo of me and Thomas, the last one we ever took together. Thanksgiving 2009. He was in his training fatigues, and I was in a borrowed sweater, grinning with my arm awkwardly around his shoulder. We were both faking it. He wasn't as untouchable as everyone thought. In that photo, his eyes were tired, haunted, and I knew then, even if I hadn't admitted it at the time, that Thomas had carried our father's expectations like a live grenade, and it went off. He died during a nighttime ocean navigation exercise, fell overboard. They said he was too exhausted, dehydrated. The Navy called it an accident. But I always wondered, what if it wasn't just the water that pulled him under? What if it was the weight of not being allowed to fail? I remember asking Dad once after the funeral if he thought Thomas had been happy. He looked at me like I'd spoken a foreign language. Happiness doesn't matter. Duty does. And that was when I knew nothing I ever did would be enough. That night in my apartment, I pulled out a notepad and started writing. I didn't know what I was writing. It wasn't a report. It wasn't a journal entry. It was just words. A letter. To him. But halfway through, I realized I wasn't writing to my father. I was writing to the girl I used to be, the one who needed so badly to be seen. I wrote, "You don't have to prove anything to anyone who refuses to see you, especially not someone who chose blindness over love." When I put the pen down, my hand ached. But for the first time in weeks, my chest didn't. Maybe I didn't need him to change. Maybe I needed to change what he meant to me. I won the Director's Award for Outstanding Service 2 weeks later. They held the ceremony in a small auditorium in D.C. Mahogany walls, cream-colored carpet, a podium with the seal of the Federal Bureau of Investigation etched in bronze. I wore my best suit, shook the right hands, smiled for the cameras. They read a short bio before I walked on stage. Jordan Whitaker, Special Agent Cybercrimes Division. Lead investigator for Operation Glass Veil, instrumental in bringing down a multinational identity fraud network spanning 12 countries. Applause. Flashes. Someone from the Department of Justice said something about trailblazers and the future of law enforcement, and I smiled, nodded, accepted the plaque, even gave a short speech, thanked the team, thanked the Bureau, mentioned the victims. I did everything right. And then I walked off stage into the quiet green room and broke. Not visibly, not dramatically. I just sat down, still holding the plaque in both hands, and stared at it like it was a slab of marble I didn't recognize. My shoulders sagged. My throat burned. I kept waiting for the wave of satisfaction to crash over me, but it never came, because none of it felt real. I had climbed the mountain, and at the top there was no air. No celebration, no relief, just an old, familiar voice echoing in my chest. "Doesn't change what you are." I went back to my apartment that night, still in my heels, still holding the plaque. I didn't turn on the lights, just dropped everything by the door, peeled off my blazer, and collapsed onto the couch. My living room looked the same as always, sparse, clean, quiet. Books on the shelf, a framed degree on the wall, one small picture of me and my Quantico class at graduation. I'd always kept my space minimal. It made it easier to control. But that night it felt sterile, like a waiting room for a life I still hadn't fully entered. I curled up in the corner of the couch, arms wrapped around myself, and let the silence drown me. My phone buzzed 3 times. Texts from coworkers, a voice memo from Tanya saying, "You were amazing girl," and a missed call from a number I didn't recognize. I didn't care. I turned the phone face down and let the tears come. Not loud, not messy, just steady. The kind of tears you cry when the world tells you you've made it, but the one person you needed to hear it from, the one person you've built your entire sense of self around proving wrong, never called back. I don't know how long I stayed there. Hours, maybe. At some point, I wandered to the bookshelf and pulled down an old photo album. I hadn't touched it in years. The leather binding was cracked. The pages smelled like dust and childhood. I flipped to a page near the end. There he was, Thomas. In uniform, standing in front of the water smile too tight for comfort. I was beside him in jeans and a hoodie, half laughing at something he'd just said. I could still remember the wind that day. Still remember how he looked at me when Dad turned his back. "You're gonna be okay," he'd said. I hadn't believed him. Not then. I turned the page and found a picture I hadn't seen in years. Thomas at 13, me at 10, standing side by side in the backyard, while Dad watched from the porch. We were trying to hold salutes, but mine was crooked. My face was scrunched in concentration. His was perfect, of course. Even then. Dad didn't smile in the picture. He rarely did. But looking at it now, I noticed something else. I wasn't trying to please him. I was trying to keep up with Thomas. And when he died, I lost more than a brother. I lost the only person who ever saw me in that house. I slid down to the floor photo album still open in my lap and finally whispered something I hadn't said out loud in years. "I miss you, Tommy." Saying it didn't make it better, but it made it real. The grief I'd buried in ambition came back with a vengeance, twisting through me, knotting up everything I'd used to hold myself together. I saw it all then, every late night, every overachieved goal, every moment I'd chased perfection, not for myself, but for a ghost, and for a man who'd never once said, "I'm proud of you." What do you do when you reach the top and realize you were climbing the wrong mountain? I sat with that question until the sky began to pale, and then slowly I got up. I walked to the bathroom, washed my face, looked at the tired woman in the mirror and didn't look away. I saw her, and for the first time I asked myself not what would make him proud, but what would make me whole. The answer didn't come right away, but the next morning I opened my laptop. I pulled up the list of names from the glass veil case, dozens of people we'd helped, victims, survivors, people who'd called to say thank you, people who were still rebuilding. I opened the folder labeled Victim Impact Statements. I started to read, and somewhere deep inside a new voice stirred, quieter than my father's, gentler than my grief. One that said, "You did this. You made this better. Maybe not for him, but for them. And maybe, just maybe, that could be enough." I didn't show up to the office the next morning, or the day after that. I called Agent Ramirez first thing and told him I needed to take my personal leave. I expected questions, maybe some red tape. Instead, he just said, "Good, take it. You've earned more than just a few days. Go find your center Whitaker." I hung up and sat at the edge of my bed, suitcase unopened beside me. I hadn't even packed yet. I wasn't sure where I was going. I just knew I couldn't stay there, not in that apartment, not in D.C., not in the echo chamber of my own doubts. By noon, I had booked a flight to Tennessee. There was a small town just outside Knoxville, Hickory Glen. Nothing flashy. Just rows of modest homes, wide porches, and a local diner that had somehow survived the storm of chains and franchises. One of the primary victims of Operation Glass Veil had lived there, Cynthia Graves, 52, single mother, former accountant. She'd had her entire retirement drained by the ring we took down. Lost her home. Nearly lost custody of her youngest daughter. She was one of the first people we contacted when the operation ended. I remembered her voice shaky but grateful. "You don't know what this means," she'd said. I didn't think anyone cared. I hadn't planned on meeting any of the victims personally. That wasn't usually part of our work, but something in me needed to. I reached out through the local liaison. She agreed to meet, So that's how I found myself sitting in the corner booth of a diner with peeling wallpaper and the scent of bacon grease soaked into the floorboards, watching Cynthia walk in worn jeans, crow's feet hair pulled back in a messy bun. She looked like every tired woman I'd ever seen who had survived more than she let on. "Agent Whitaker," she asked cautiously. I stood and offered my hand. "Just Jordan." She smiled then. A little. We sat. The conversation wasn't formal. It didn't need to be. She told me about the months she spent trying to convince banks she hadn't taken out loans she'd never seen. How friends stopped calling. How her daughter, age 11, started waking up screaming because she thought they'd be homeless. "How do you explain to a kid that the money you thought you had was never really yours?" she asked, her voice thin. I listened. I didn't interrupt. I didn't try to fix anything. I just let her speak. Then, something unexpected happened. Her daughter Marley came in near the end of our conversation, small, shy, clinging to a stuffed fox with one ear missing. She slid into the booth beside her mom and looked at me like I was some sort of TV character. "You helped us," she whispered. I nodded. "I helped a lot of people, but I'm glad I helped you too." She looked down at her fox. "Mom says you're a hero." I tried to smile, but my throat closed. That means a lot. Then she did something that undid me completely. She leaned over and hugged me. It wasn't long. Maybe 3 seconds. Maybe 4. But it shattered something inside me, something hard and sharp that had lived in my ribs for years. I blinked fast and managed a quiet, "Thank you." We walked outside after that. Cynthia said goodbye, told me to keep doing what I was doing, but Marley lingered. She tugged on my sleeve and said, "Do you ever get scared?" I looked at her and answered honestly, "Every day." She nodded like she understood more than she should have. Then she said, "Me too. But when you called us, I didn't feel so scared anymore." And just like that, everything clicked. That girl had never met my father. She didn't care what kind of childhood I had. She didn't know what it took for me to earn my badge or how much I bled to prove I belonged in a world that never opened the door for girls like me. She just knew I helped her mom. And for her, that was enough. That night, I went back to my rented room and pulled out the letter I'd started writing, the one to my father. I finished it. I didn't hold back. I wrote about what it felt like to grow up invisible, about how Thomas was more than a soldier, he was my best friend, about how it broke me when he died, and how I tried to become what my father wanted even when it nearly destroyed me. But I didn't end it with blame. I ended it with something different. "You never said the words I needed, but I'm learning to live without them, and I've decided to stop looking for your voice in every crowd. From now on, I'll be listening for mine." I folded it, placed it in an envelope, addressed it, and then I tore it in half. Because it wasn't about him. It never really had been. That next morning, I went for a long walk through the neighborhood birds, chirping children riding bikes, someone mowing a lawn 2 houses down. It was normal, soft, real. And somewhere in that quiet morning, I decided I was done chasing shadows. I didn't need my father to call me anything, because I knew who I was now. And so did that little girl in the diner. 3 weeks after Tennessee, I stood outside the house I had once called home. Same porch, same paint, same flag flapping in the breeze. It was a strange feeling standing there in slacks and a pressed blouse, an FBI badge tucked in my purse like a grown woman cosplaying her childhood. My hand hovered over the doorbell longer than I'd like to admit. I hadn't told anyone I was coming. Not my mother. Not him. I half expected no one to be home. But the door opened quicker than I anticipated. Jordan. My mother gasped. Her face looked thinner than I remembered, lined with years I hadn't seen pass. Her eyes searched mine like she didn't quite believe I was real. "Hi, Mom," I said, voice catching. She stepped back without a word and pulled me into her arms. It wasn't a long hug. My mother never lingered. But in that brief embrace, I felt something I hadn't in years, a piece of home still flickering behind the silence. Inside the living room was almost identical to how I left it. Same tan couch, same framed photo of Thomas in uniform on the mantel. The only change was the absence of any sound, no television, no radio, just the quiet hum of air through the vents. "He's out back," she said, as if we were talking about a neighbor, not the man who had fractured my spine with silence for over a decade. I nodded. "I won't stay long." She touched my hand. "He's different. Since Thomas. Since everything. But not always better." I didn't answer. I stepped through the sliding door and onto the porch. And there he was. My father, Colonel Alan Whitaker, retired, was seated at the weathered picnic table polishing an old .45 pistol he probably hadn't fired in years. His back was straight, his sleeves rolled to the elbow. Same buzz cut. Same iron spine. He looked up when he heard the door. His eyes met mine and didn't look away. "Jordan," he said, like a statement, not a greeting. I stood there taking him in. The man who had given me his jawline but not his voice. The man who had loved my brother so loudly and me so invisibly. "Mind if I sit?" I asked. He shrugged once. "Your house too, I guess." We sat in silence. The sun was low on the horizon. A few birds chirped nearby. The pistol gleamed in his hands. "I was in Tennessee last week," I said. He didn't respond. I met one of the women our investigation helped. Her daughter hugged me. Still nothing. I leaned forward. "I didn't come here to prove anything. Not anymore." He stopped polishing and set the pistol down. "Then why are you here?" "Because I needed to stop letting you live inside my decisions. Because I wanted you to see me and finally feel something human. Because I wanted to bury the ghost of your voice once and for all." Instead, I just said, "Because I don't want your absence to shape the rest of my life." He blinked. "Just once." "You think I've been absent?" I almost laughed. "You were in the room, sure, but never there." His jaw twitched. "I spent years trying to be what you respected, and all it did was kill pieces of me." "You're an FBI agent," he said flatly. "That's not nothing. No, it's not. And I did that without you." A flicker crossed his face, brief, almost imperceptible. Maybe guilt, maybe pride, maybe just recognition. "You think I didn't watch that news piece," he muttered. "You think I didn't see what you did. Then why the voicemail?" He didn't answer. I pressed on. "Do you have any idea how it felt to hear you call me a failure after everything?" He stood then, slowly, stiffly. "I was angry," he said finally. "Not at you, not really." "Then who?" He turned to look out across the yard, at myself. That stopped me cold. He kept speaking, voice lower than I'd ever heard it. "Thomas was supposed to live. You were supposed to be the one I worried about. But you survived. You fought. And He shook his head. I couldn't make sense of it. I stood too heart-hammering. "I wasn't him," I said. "I know. I'm not you either." He nodded. Silence stretched between us. Then he said it. "I didn't know how to love you the way you needed." I swallowed hard. "I know." He looked at me, eyes raw. "But you still came." "I came because I had to let you go." He nodded again, slower this time, like something inside him had finally settled. I turned to leave, but paused at the door. "Dad." He looked up. "You were wrong. I did bleed for this country, just not in a way you could see." He didn't answer, but as I walked inside, I heard his voice behind me. "You didn't embarrass us, Jordan. It wasn't an apology, but it was the closest he'd ever come. And I let it be enough." The flight back to D.C. was quiet. I stared out the window most of the way, watching the landscape shift beneath me, rolling green, then rivers, then the grids of city blocks coming into view. I clutched a cup of lukewarm coffee in my hand, not because I needed it, but because it gave me something to hold, something to ground me. I had come back lighter, not healed, not entirely, but unburdened. When I walked into my apartment that evening, the air felt different, warmer. I noticed the way the evening light fell through the blinds, the specks of dust floating like tiny planets. I hadn't seen them before. I'd been too busy surviving. I set down my keys, placed my badge and ID on the side table like I always did, and paused. Then I took the FBI plaque, the one I hadn't hung up yet from the closet, and mounted it on the wall. Not because I needed a reminder of my accomplishments, but because I finally knew they weren't about him. They were about me. 2 days later, I was back at the bureau. Ramirez greeted me with a quiet nod in the hallway. Tanya gave me a full hug and whispered, "We missed you." I smiled. Meant it. I dove back into the routine paperwork case reviews team briefings. But something had changed. The sharp edges of urgency had softened. The need to prove something had dulled. A few weeks in, I took on a new mentorship role. Fresh recruits straight out of Quantico. One of them, a young woman named Priya, reminded me of myself. Sharp eyes, faster brain, always trying to be the last one to leave the office. I pulled her aside one afternoon. "You don't have to outwork your ghosts," I told her gently. She blinked. "What do you mean? You can be excellent without bleeding out for it." "That's still allowed." She nodded slowly. I knew she didn't fully understand yet, but she would. That weekend, I volunteered to speak at a cybersecurity workshop for high school girls. It wasn't mandatory, no credit, just something I felt pulled to do. They were awkward and curious and wildly brilliant. Some of them had never even thought about the FBI as a place for someone like them. One girl, maybe 15, asked, "Do you ever feel like you're not supposed to be there?" I laughed. "All the time. But what do? I show up anyway." At the end of the session, they asked for a photo. I stood in the middle, flanked by a dozen girls in oversized hoodies and anxious grins. And for the first time in a long time, I smiled without reservation. That night, I wrote in my journal, the one I started in Tennessee. I wrote about Marley and Cynthia, about Thomas and the porch, about the sound of my father's voice when he said, "You didn't embarrass us." I wrote one final sentence at the bottom of the page: "I am no longer building my life in the shadow of someone else's silence." I closed the journal and felt peace settle in my chest like a stone sinking to still water. Some nights I still hear my father's voice, but it no longer commands me. It no longer dictates the trajectory of my breath or the sharpness of my ambition. Now it's just a voice, one among many. Because louder than him now is the voice of that little girl who once sat on the porch, clutching a blue ribbon and wishing to be seen. And finally, I see her. She's grown now, stronger, sharper, quieter perhaps, but not invisible. She doesn't need to be anyone's legacy. She is her own. And when I walk the halls of the Bureau now, I don't walk with a chip on my shoulder. I walk as Special Agent Jordan Whitaker, not because I earned a badge or took down a cybercrime empire or survived the childhood that tried to shrink me, but because I chose to heal. Because I chose me. And if you asked me today who I am, I'd say I'm the woman who stood where silence used to live and filled it with truth. I'm not the failure my father saw. I'm the woman the FBI calls Agent Whitaker. And more importantly, I'm the woman I finally call enough.